Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing It Came From the Network. And since the last couple months I themed my It Came From the Network, and I had a lot of fun doing that. December we did Carnival Christmas, which was ICP and psychopathic related stuff in the wrestling world. January we highlighted Hulkamania because Hulkamania turned 40 years old, at least from when he won his initial WWF Championship in January. This month is February. I could have went one of two ways. I thought about doing a Valentine's themed month, but that's really only one day. So I came up with the idea, February's Black History Month. Let's celebrate it here on the channel. Let's go back and review some of the things that you can find on Peacock from the history of pro wrestling that celebrate black athletes and black excellence, and that were really groundbreaking moments. For this video, as you might see from the thumbnail, we're doing WCW Saturday Night. It's marked as Season 1, Episode 19 from August 8th, 1992. And you'll see right away why I chose this, why this was something I thought would be fitting for the theme. If you haven't watched any of my videos previously, I do grade everything on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the worst and 5 being the best. With that being said, let's jump right into the show itself. We start off right off the bat with the reason why I chose this. We get a little snippet of a match for the WCW Championship between Big Van Vader and Ron Simmons. And they only show us a little bit, they only hype it up a bit, and we're going to see it later in the show, more of it. But they just wanted to give us a teaser here, something to stay tuned for. This was very much in the time of flipping around channels, and if something caught your eye, you would stay on that channel. It's not like today where we have everything on demand or DVR or streaming. You wanted to get someone to watch your show the second they tuned in, and this was a great way. Coming off of that, we get our hosts of the show, which is Jim Ross and Cowboy Bill Watts. Bill Watts was the booker at the time. He's really only in these bumpers. The heavy lifting of the match calling is Jim Ross by himself. Kind of cool to see that here, because Jim Ross has often claimed that Bill Watts is his mentor, which he definitely was. Cool seeing them as a team here. Going from that, we go into our first match of the show, which is a very young Dustin Rhodes, aka The Natural, eventually returned to Goldust, going up against Mark Canterbury, which you may or may not recognize that name. He would later become Henry Godwin, but during this time he was just an enhancement talent. The one cool thing about this match, at the time Dustin was in a feud with Dick Slater and Greg Valentine, and they did the picture-in-picture thing. And it's always kind of cool because this is the kind of wrestling I grew up with, seeing little picture-in-picture interviews while the match was going on. That's something I kind of wish they would bring back a bit, because it was very cool, very much kept you informed, kept you on what the feud was, especially in non-consequential matches here like this. This is a glorified squash match. Overall, this is a good match. I enjoyed it. Dustin Rhodes does pick up the win because obviously I'm giving this one a 3. I thought it was good. Next up, we get a highlight, and this is going to tell the story on how we got to Vader versus Ron Simmons. This is from August 2nd, almost a week before this. They were in Baltimore at a house show, and we had a match with Rick Rude versus Nikita Koloff. During the match, Cactus Jack came out to attack Nikita Koloff. Sting was on commentary with Jim Ross, which I don't know why Sting was on commentary for a house show, but I digress. I guess they did hype that they were going to show this match the next night on the Sunday show. Sting comes out to help his friend and Nikita Koloff, which brings us out of the crowd and debuting Jake the Snake Roberts. And this was one of those kind of cliche moments now where we get he doesn't even wrestle here, what is he doing here, which has been done to death. Jake DDTs Sting onto a chair a few times, thus injuring his neck, bringing out the face locker room, which included the Steiners and Ron Simmons and Barry Windham. This was a good highlight video, a good segment to set up what we would see later. I'm giving this one a 5. After that, we get Bill Watts comes out to the ring. He invites a bunch of wrestlers down. He basically says, we're going to put all your names into a bag, and whatever name David Penzer pulls out, he's going to be the one that's going to take Sting's place and challenge Vader for the World Championship. because we promised these fans a championship match and we're going to give it to them. The name that gets pulled out, Ron Simmons. That leads us right into a highlight of the match with Ron Simmons and Big Van Vader, which was kind of quick, kind of chopped together, just the high spots of the match, which is okay. The one negative I will give this is this match didn't happen on a planned pay-per-view or a planned show. It happened at a house show, which I know why they did it, and I know the reasoning. You want to bring people to house shows, anything can happen. The championship can change at a house show. But for how historic this was, I feel like it would have been better served to have been on a pay-per-view. If you don't know, Ron Simmons picks up the win, becomes the first black WCW World Champion, and depending on what you consider a world championship, he may be the first major black world champion. In previous generations, Bobo Brazil and Bearcat Wright won the WWA World Championship, but it was more considered a territory. This was back when the NWA Championship was the World Championship, even though they kind of split off from the NWA and they were their own thing, and they worked with Japan, they worked with the JWA, and then eventually New Japan Pro Wrestling. So it's a little bit muddy. A lot of people do recognize him as the first. Other people recognize either Bobo Brazil or Bearcat Wright. Bearcat, I think, came before Bobo. And that lineage even gets questioned even further, because when Bearcat Wright was a champion, I believe they were still part of the NWA. You see what I mean? Like I said, I thought this was really great. I'm giving this a 5. I really enjoyed how they built the story and gave us the payoff. I kind of wish they would have spaced it out more, put this a couple matches more down the road, just to, give us something to keep us interested, which is kind of what I felt they were going to do. Afterwards, we get an interview with Tony Schiavone and Ron Simmons. He's talking about how he always wanted to be a world champion. This was his dream. Great interview. A lot of people don't talk about how good of a talker Ron Simmons, aka Farouk, was. They narrow him down to his one catchphrase of "damn," and that's it. But he was a really good talker, and he was a great athlete. He's a guy I kind of think, even with all the accolades he got, he didn't quite get to where he should have. I think he was held back a bit. I think he could have been a multiple-time world champion, and as seen by the crowd that was here, the crowd got behind him. The crowd went crazy when he won. And it wasn't just because they hated Vader, it's because they loved Ron Simmons. After that, we go back to our in-studio matches, and when people talk about missing studio wrestling, this is the kind of show they talk about, where you had highlight clips shown from the arenas, when you had interviews spliced in, and then you would have matches from the studio. The next match we have is Dangerous Dan Spivey versus Ron Stallings. Spivey was just a little bit before his Waylon Mercy gimmick, which was well before its time. I don't remember timeline-wise if this was before or after the Skyscrapers, but to me, Danny Spivey is one of those kind of forgotten good wrestlers that I used to have a lot of fun watching, especially in his Skyscrapers and Waylon Mercy run. Spivey picks up a quick win here. This wasn't a great match. I'm going to give this one a 2. Next up, we have a tag team match, which has all the earmarkings of Bill Watts. We got the Junkyard Dog teaming up with the Big Cat, Mr. Hughes, which Mr. Hughes was kind of wearing a Junkyard Dog themed gear to the ring and in the match. This is the kind of thing that Bill Watts tried to do in Mid-South after Junkyard Dog left, and that was create a new Junkyard Dog. JYD wasn't what he was 8-10 years ago here, and Mr. Hughes was up and coming. And I think he really could have gained a lot here. They're teaming up to go against Chris Sullivan and James Mates, which, again, obviously this is an enhancement match. I like the idea of this team. I kind of forgot that it happened. Again, much like I said with Danny Spivey, Mr. Hughes is a wrestler I enjoyed back in the day. Junkyard Dog was one of my favorites as a kid. Of course, JYD and the Big Cat pick up the win. Another kind of ho-hum, uninspiring match. I'm giving this one a 2 as well. Next up, we have Heavy Metal Van Hammer going up against Tracy Smothers. And this is interesting because even at the time, the Van Hammer gimmick felt dated. He was dressed like a 80s hair metal guy on the likes of a Poison or a Rat or Winger or any of those bands. And not saying that any of those bands are bad. You gotta remember, this was right after Nirvana broke. This was after Pearl Jam had came on the scene. Alice in Chains was out there, Soundgarden. So the grunge movement was starting to bubble up. And it pretty much killed that generation of rock stars. And I kind of wonder, if Van Hammer wasn't saddled with this gimmick, where would his career have went? Because he wasn't bad in the ring, he wasn't the best wrestler, but he wasn't the worst. He had a look, he looked great, he could do some things. This was a good match, I enjoyed it. Again, this is a what if. What would have happened if Van Hammer had a different gimmick? What if he would have debuted as a grunge rocker and predated the guy on my shirt, Raven, who we eventually would be in the stable of? I thought this was fun. It was a little bit more than an enhancement match because Tracy Smothers was a known name at the time. Hammer does pick up the win here. I'm giving this one a 3. Next up, we have another tag team match. We get Dick Slater and Greg Valentine going up against Ian Watson and the Italian Stallion. If you're a fan of late 80s, early 90s wrestling, you'll remember the Italian Stallion as pretty much a mainstay on the undercard as a enhancement guy. He wrestled in both WWF and WCW. This match was kind of slow. As much as I like Slater and Valentine, I do like both of them as wrestlers. I feel like they were both just a bit past their prime. Valentine more so than Slater. This had a kind of out of nowhere ending with Valentine putting on the figure 4. I thought it was okay. Slater and Valentine do pick up the win. I'm giving this one a 2. Next up, we get an interview with Jake the Snake Roberts, being interviewed by Jesse the Body Ventura, and he explains why he's there, why he attacked Sting, and this is awesome. It's Jake the Snake Roberts, one of the great talkers of all time, explaining his actions. Jesse Ventura being the heel commentator, hyping him up and giving him his respect while he's there. I rather enjoyed this promo. That's followed up with a match with the Barbarian, going up against Tommy Angel. Much like I said with a lot of these matches, this was just a squash match. Barbarian runs through him. Again, not much here, not really enjoyable. I'm giving this one a 2. Then we get a backstage segment, an interview with Paul Heyman and the Miracle Violence Connection, which is Dr. Death Steve Williams and Terry Bam Bam Gordy. The crux of this is Gordy and Williams have paid off Heyman to have the Dangerous Alliance take out the Steiner Brothers, because the Steiner Brothers were the only challengers to them at the time. At the time, they were both the WCW and NWA Tag Team Champions, which is a moment, I guess you could say. This was pretty cool. I mean, early Paul Heyman, Paulie Dangerously, early Wise Man. I loved him here. He was always a great talker and a great manager. This was fun. That leads us right into what would be the main event of the show. We get Arn Anderson and Bobby Eaton with Paul Dangerously as part of the Dangerous Alliance, going up against Brian Pillman and Larry Zbyszko, who had recently, at the time of this event, left the Dangerous Alliance. And they gave this time. I think they gave this about 20-25 minutes. So probably on the actual show, it was probably more like 40 with commercial breaks put in there. I thought this was fun. I mean, all 4 guys are great wrestlers here. I do feel like it did overstay its welcome a bit. And one thing that was a trope of the Bill Watts era, they waived the top rope rule, which if you don't remember, if you weren't around at the time, Bill Watts had implemented a rule that wrestlers couldn't come off of the top rope where they'd be disqualified because it's too dangerous. I did like this match. I wanted to like it more than I did, and I think it's just the fact that it overstayed its welcome a bit, and it felt like it wasn't a long match because it needed to be a long match. It felt like it was a long match because they needed to fill time, if that makes sense to you. Arn Anderson and Bobby Eaton pick up the win here. I'm giving this one a 3. Then we end the show with Harley Race and Big Van Vader, and Vader's basically saying he wants a rematch. He doesn't fault Ron Simmons for the way he won it, and he's not going to hold it against him, but he wants his championship back, and he wants to get it back ASAP. I thought this was really good. It showed that Vader wasn't going to be out of the picture, that he wasn't going to just let it be something that fades away. I enjoyed this. Great promo to end the show. All in all, this had a lot of the drawbacks of the time, the squash matches, which to me, watching now, are boring for the most part, but it had a lot of the things that I loved at the time. The picture-in-picture, which was used in almost all of the matches, and you could probably see it in the screenshots that I took to put up here during this review. I like that. I like the way they did the interviews here. They felt special. I like the fact that they included clips of house shows to make the house shows feel more important. Right now, if WWE held a house show, I'd probably not go to it just because you know nothing important's going to happen there. But back at this time, something important could happen there. We had stuff like Ron Simmons winning the World Championship. Just a year or two later, Kevin Nash beat Bob Backlund at a Madison Square Garden show. Even just a few years after that, Edge won the Intercontinental Championship off of Jeff Jarrett at a house show. So it gave you reason to go to these shows that weren't going to be televised. I like the feel of this, and much like I said with the studio wrestling, how people want to go back to that, this is kind of the show they were talking about. This also feels like that sports-based presentation that we often hear people talk about. Tony Khan mentions that he wants to bring that into AEW. I feel like they really had that here. Big moments were replayed, matches had consequences, the rules were strictly enforced more. So yeah, it made a lot of sense. And this, overall, the historic significance, like I said, I do wish that Ron Simmons would have had that as a pay-per-view event or something bigger. For as massive as that moment is in the history of wrestling, I feel with there being no build-up to it, it doesn't have the same gravity that it should, but it was a great moment. Overall, I'm going to give the show a 3. A lot of the matches drag it down. The promos, the highlights, the tag team match at the end, the Dustin Rhodes and future Henry Godwin match at the beginning, they're pretty much the highlights of the show. I did like the presentation. I do like the flow of it, but again, I guess it could be just looking at this 30 plus years later and looking at it with 30 plus years more of watching wrestling, that squash matches don't feel as important as they did back then. I do recommend watching this, even if it's just to watch those moments with Ron Simmons winning, because like I said, it's so important and it fits so much with the theme that we're doing this month. In my opinion, one of the great moments in WCW history. It really fit in here. Like I said, overall the show had its ups and downs. I would say if this was a weekly show, formatted just the exact same way, I'd tune in every week because it felt like you need to tune in to watch this. And when I say that, I mean if it was a weekly show now. I did tune in every week back then. All in all, historically important moment on a pretty up and down show. Like I said, if you made it here to the end, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't, all that fun stuff that all the other YouTube people tell you to do. And leave me a comment. Let me know another moment in wrestling history that would tie into the Black History Month theme that we're doing that you'd like to see. I have a couple in mind, but I am open to suggestions, so leave me a comment on what you'd like to see. If we get a lot of comments on one thing and it's available for me to watch, hopefully on Peacock or YouTube or someone easily, I'll take that into account and add it to my list to watch. But anyway, I digress. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and you've been watching It Came From the Network.